Assalamu alaikum. Hi, Hans.
Hi, Shireen. I can hear you. Very good. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Very good.
Yeah, very good.
My camera is blocked.
Can you try again?
No, it tells me it's blocked by... No, okay, now I can share. Oh, hi, Douglas. Nice to see you.
Okay. So we can see you very clearly.
Very good. I can see Douglas, but I cannot hear him yet.
Okay. So we are starting soon because some people are asking. Now, لسه هنبدأ. Just give quick. I want to ensure we can see Douglas clearly.
I can hear you. I can hear you very well.
Yeah. Douglas, can you try to rejoin if you can? Can you exit and re-enter again?
Should I already?
I don't know if he can hear me, but I think he heard it because he left and he will join again. Okay? So I'll just give quick intro in Arabic and we start in English, okay?
Okay, so you tell me when I should start and when I should share the screen, right?
You will start after Douglas, okay?
Okay, so you tell me when I need to start, right?
Okay. So السلام عليكم. أنا بس هبدأ بالعربي بسرعة. إحنا النهاردة الكونفرنس عندنا 4 متحدثين، 2 هيتكلموا بالإنجليش وبعد كده هيكون في 2 بالعربي. فإحنا هنبتدي بالإنجليش مستر دوغلاس كنت، وبعد كده another English هو من أمريكا، هو الهيد بتاع American Supply Chain Management Institute في العالم. بعد كده هيكون معانا مستر هانز هانز من شركة اسمها انفينيون، وهو هيشارك معانا الستوري والقصة وليه حصل مشكلة في الشيبس وورلد وايد. بعد كده هيكون عندنا حديث باللغة العربية مع العرض بالإنجليش من مهندس إبراهيم صيام من شركة شنايدر. وبعد كده هيكون عندنا الأستاذة ندى من شاي الربيع برضو بالعربي. فأنا هستسمحكم إن إحنا هنحاول للغة الإنجليزية. أول ساعة وربع هتكون بالإنجليش أو أول ساعة، وبعد كده إن شاء الله هنتحول إلى اللغة العربية. Okay. So first I would like to welcome everyone. Today we have a very special event because it's our 5th conference. By the way, Hans was attending the 3rd one. Remember Hans?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, okay. It was in Cairo. Today we have a conference regarding supply chain excellence and future of supply chain, digital supply chain. We start first by Douglas Kent. Douglas is from ASCM. He is the head or VP of strategic alliances globally. So he will give us an interesting speech about supply chain and presentation. After that, we will move in English. Second English lecture or speech or presentation will be by our friend Hans. Hans will give us overview and details about why it happens, the problem of chips globally, worldwide. Later, we will move to an English material but Arabic presentation by Ibrahim Siam. He is from Schneider, who is speaking Arabic. And last presentation will be by our colleague Nada. Nada, she is from Saudi. She is leading demand planning team in a famous tea company in Saudi Arabia. It's called AMS Bashan or Rabia Tea. Okay, so thank you everyone who joined us today. We are super excited about meeting you all, listening to your questions. Every presenter will give his presentation and will give short time for questions. In case you have a question, please write it in Q&A, or it's better than writing it in the chat. We have a very interactive day. We are so happy to meet everyone with you today. Thank you for joining us. It's your weekend. We know this very well. And we are super excited about having everyone here. So We choose the speakers today because they have great knowledge to share with us, tell us how they can help us, how they share their experience. So usually when we start, we'd like to ask you to write in the chat which country you are from. فضلا اكتبوا في الشات من أي بلد. يعني كل واحد يكتب كده which country you are from. Okay, South Africa, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Sudan. Wow. Saudi, Egypt, KSA. Okay, Egypt. So many from Egypt school. Okay, KSA and Egypt. Interesting. Okay. So Egypt, that's interesting. Thank you everyone who's joining us today. So I would like first to welcome everyone and all the speakers. So Douglas, can you check please if it's working for you? We still can't hear you.
You're still muted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you and see you. Perfect. Fantastic. Okay, you can start, please.
And now you can see my screen, hopefully.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So today I'd like to talk about 3 topics that are relative to the future supply chain. The first topic is around supply chain resiliency. So this is an interesting study that we did with ASCM in collaboration with the Economist Intelligence Unit that really helps to describe some common vulnerabilities that companies have relative to resiliency. We'll talk about that from a strategic and operational perspective. Also, I'd like to talk about sustainability and the criticality of making sure that we're balancing our economic, our ecological, and our ethical considerations within the supply chain. And then the last is really to talk about the top 10. Hans will remember this one very well with regards to what are the top 10 trends that our supply chain is facing over the next 3 to 5 years. So let's go ahead and jump right in and first talk about these vulnerabilities. So as I mentioned before, what we did is we partnered just after the pandemic started, we partnered with the Economist Intelligence Unit to do a study on supply chain resiliency, to figure out what disruptions mean in terms of the impacts that those disruptions can have to supply chains, and what can companies do in terms of best practices to help to resolve some of the vulnerabilities that exist. So this collaboration was, as I said, done with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and is now that population of participation is growing. And I'll talk a little bit about how companies, if you're interested, can also participate in a similar benchmark study. In the first study, we had 308 publicly listed US-based companies that participated. And we released the results after doing the data collection in October of 2020. We also had a series of industry experts and panelists that were also involved, both in the creation of the study and the insights that revealed. One of the key questions that we asked the participants of the study is, in this world of supply chain, what's likely to be the disruption that affects you most in the next 12 months? Now, had we done this study 3 years ago, pandemic probably wouldn't have even been on the list. But because this was done after the pandemic started, that of course topped the list. But if you look at the other disruptions, which have a very strong potential for having great impact to a company's profitability, and also the likelihood associated with these particular disruptions, almost everything on the list, most companies could raise their hand and say, this is the threat that's real to me. And in many cases, this is a threat that's happened to me. It actually has been a disruption, whether that be a cyber attack, which is quite prolific these days, concerns about supplier or partner bankruptcy, their solvency, natural disasters, labor shortages, labor cost increases, as we mentioned, chip shortages in terms of raw material capabilities. All of these types of things these aren't just thoughts that we're having. They're actually realities. These are disruptions that are affecting companies' ability to create revenue or their ability to maintain profitability. So very, very high concern. So obviously, these level of disruptions that have occurred are continuing to have impacts to companies. And of course, it elevates supply chain as a C-suite topic. So that's both good and bad. The good news is everybody knows the importance of supply chain now. And the difficult struggle of that, of course, is that we're continuing to be faced with a layered effect of disruption. So within the study, what we did is we constructed it in two different ways. One talking more about the operational supply chain and one more around the strategic supply chain issues. So on the operational side, what we're talking about is our ability to bounce back, to some state of normal affairs, whatever that new normal might be. We talk about how do we position, how do we prepare it, how do we sense that an event might occur, how do we go through mitigation efforts to respond to any sort of a disruption. But on the strategic side, arguably slightly more difficult, is not only how do we bounce back, how do we bounce forward, and how do we adapt to whatever a new normal is. A big, probably the most prolific example of that is the ability to bounce forward into a new normal, which leads us into an entire digital transformation. Many companies accelerated their digital transformation because of the pandemic. So they took a 5-year digital plan and they compressed it into 12 months, right? And really had to adapt to a new normal. So in these strategic capabilities, we talk about our ability to lead, our ability to build, and our ability to transform. So looking both at the strategic as well as the operational resiliency. So what did the study reveal? There were 4 key highlights that were revealed in the study. And the first one has been around for a long time and we still haven't tackled the problem. And that is really around our lack of visibility in a multi-tier, multi-hierarchical supply chain. Can we really see deep into the supply chain, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, for example, to understand the vulnerabilities that might exist? And that lack of visibility is constraining to us because how do we mitigate risks that we don't know exist, right? So it's really critical that we're able to identify potential risks or disruptive elements in a multi-hierarchical basis. Having that sort of control tower view that gives us the visibility that will enable us to be able to be more resilient. The second one is really around strategic supply chain management, and particularly on the supplier relationship management side. We have to have incredibly strong relationships with our key suppliers to ensure that we're managing risk together. It's not a one-party game here. We need to be able to have our supply base and our key suppliers moving together with us, helping us together mitigate those risks. So how are we promoting those strategic supply chain resiliency elements? By building stronger relationships with our key suppliers. The third highlight that was unveiled is around business continuity planning and specific playbooks. So we shouldn't try to be figuring out what to do when a disruption happens, but rather we know what to do if it happens. So having a playbook about how do we keep business continuity, how do we keep our revenue streams, how do we maintain profitability, how do we maintain customer service in light of a disruptive event actually happening? And so can we have those playbooks pre-established so we're not trying to figure out what to do after the event occurs? We already know what to do should it actually occur. And the fourth one is really disappointing. And of course, we'll talk further about sustainability, but how do we really take climate impacting factors into our supply chain and really operationalize those? There are so many companies that state their sustainability aspirations, but they haven't yet really figured out how to operationalize that into the supply chain. And we'll talk further about these sustainability factors. So if we take each one of these and break it down, maybe I'd just like to highlight a couple of the key best practices that help to ensure that these vulnerabilities, these weaknesses, these concerns in resiliency are best being tackled. So in the first case, if we take a look at the supply chain visibility, again, this lack of being able to see inside of our supply chain deep across all hierarchical levels. We need to be able to identify who our tier 1 suppliers are, and we need to see that information not only at the tier 1 basis, but all the way down into tiers 2 and 3, as I mentioned earlier. We need to have visibility of all the factors that potentially can impact both the supply side, but also the demand side. And this is really outside-in signals. What sort of data is available, structured or unstructured, big, little data, what kinds of signals exist that give us an impression that there might be something that needs to be changed in order to mitigate a potential risk? What kind of signals do we have? It really changes the way we think about a traditional, quite linear S&OP process, for example. And then there are other aspects, as I mentioned earlier. Control towers are key elements to gain that visibility, and also doing more with analytics, right? And I'll talk about that later when we get into our top 10, because analytics has topped this list of top 10 trends now for 2 years in a row. So we continue to try to understand more, to try to take data and pull it in and make it information. The difference, of course, between data and information is that information supports our ability to take decisions. So having analytics available to us so we could react more quickly is obviously key to gaining supply chain visibility. And if we take a look at the second one around supplier relationship management, this is really about building joint relationships with our suppliers. It's about win-win, and it's about lose-lose, right? It's about being able to share information. It's about asking ourselves, are we a good customer to that supplier? Are we doing everything we can do to make that supplier successful? It's really interesting when people talk about the need for strategic supplier relationships, and we talk about our suppliers as partners until it comes time for a negotiation, right? And some of you are suppliers, so you know what I mean. Then we treat it more like a vendor relationship, right? Instead of really a strategic supplier. So how do we build those revenue sharing risk agreements in place and make sure that our suppliers aren't our weakness? In many cases, it has been certainly the case in these disruptive times, where there are many manufacturing companies, for example, that have stated quite publicly that the supply side of the equation is what's prohibiting them from reaching their revenue goals. It's also interesting of how disruptive events are changing the way we think about inventory, the way we think about safety stocks, for example. It's often been said that we're in a position right now, because we've had just these layered on disruptive events, everything from raw material shortages to boats getting stuck in the Suez Canal to port congestion, et cetera. All of these related events are just stacking up on us, that we've moved from a position of just-in-time inventory, JIT, of course, just-in-time, to JIC, just-in-case, having inventories that are being put into play in order to help to mitigate risk. And of course, just to hit on a couple of others, it's very important for us to have a common performance management system in place. How are we measuring each other's performance? And not just typical quantitative measures, but also how are we impacting each other's business? Taking a look at ensuring that those performance management systems are in place and that we're strategically monitoring our performance together, to hit on a few of those examples. In the third one, we'll talk about business response playbooks, or this business continuity. Again, here, what we're looking at is making sure that we understand the potential of a risk event occurring. This goes right back to the heart of one of the key metrics that we've identified in our SCORE model, if you're familiar with that. And this is a metric called value at risk. And value at risk is quite simply around what is the potential of a risk event occurring. So it's the probability times the impact of that event. So probability times impact gives us the ability to monetize risk. And if we can monetize risk, we can stack those up and say, okay, this is the one that has the highest combination of probability times impact. So when we set up a risk register, for example, it's at the very top of that list. And then we're able to say, okay, well, this is something we need to have a very specific response to. It's high probability, high levels of impact. We need to have mitigation efforts. We need to have playbooks that really identify when a trigger happens, what is it that we're going to do? How do we manage the potential of that specific disruption? So it's really important that we have informed risk mitigation efforts that are really driven from the analytics to help us detect the probability of these events, and that we actually have a specific playbook of how to respond to that. And it's not as easy as it seems, of course, because we can't mitigate everything. We just can't afford to do that. So we need to be able to identify those with the highest degree of potential. The fourth highlight, as I mentioned, is really around the impacts of climate change. So how do we really manage the ability to operationalize our concerns around the environment into our supply chain, which affects everything we do. It affects everything from our inventory policy to our transportation decisions, to our choice of suppliers, to where we set up our manufacturing footprint. All of these things have potential impacts positively and negatively relative to our supply chain. So we need to be sure that as we set these targets, as we set these aspirations, we know exactly how what we're doing operationally within the supply chain are contributing to our impact to the environment overall. And that's not just the supply chain, it's also the design chain side. So concepts like circularity up front in the design process, these are also key aspects. So on this first topic, again, this was a study initiated because of the pandemic to help identify both strategic and operational vulnerabilities. And that process continues. So I invite you, and you see here on the link, and of course you'll get all the slides afterwards. I'm sure Shireen will share these with you. Please go to the link, and you have the ability to do your own maturity assessment, to take the very same survey that I'm sharing results on and identify your own vulnerabilities. You may find that the 4 highlights that I shared with you are the same ones you have, or you may find that you have different vulnerabilities, and then you, of course, can act to try to ensure that you raise your maturity levels where these vulnerabilities might exist. So let's talk about the sustainability aspect in a little bit more detail. We have 3 major themes that we focus on here at the Association of Supply Chain Management. The first is supply chain talent. The second is supply chain transformation. And the third is sustainability. So we worked very hard to create a set of sustainability standards that are very specific to the supply chain that help address the triple bottom line factors of economic, ecological, and ethical considerations in the supply chain. That's what's known as these 3 pillars are oftentimes referred to as the triple bottom line. So it's important that as we establish an operating model in supply chain that we're considering all of these aspects. Again, these standards that have been developed called our Enterprise Certification for Sustainability Standards gives you the ability to assess how well you're doing against these 3 pillars. So all kinds of aspects associated with the ethical and ecological aspects of the supply chain, of course, balanced with the economic considerations. So taking a look at our social responsibility, our economic sustainability, but also our ecological stewardship, which is critical. So when we built these set of standards, which are open sourced and free, again, I've included a link for that as well, is we tried to take all of these different factors into a set of criteria that are necessary for each of these 3 pillars. So as we look across the supply chain, all aspects as described by SCORE: plan, source, make, deliver, return, and we consider the economic results that we're trying to create with the supply chain, we also have to look at it from all of these lenses. Ethical side, we take a look at anti-corruption, antitrust, labor practices, human rights, IP protection, etc. On the economic side, of course, we're taking a look at, our corporate leadership, our enterprise risk, as I was mentioning earlier. We take a look at our tax and our supply chain strategy, ensuring that, of course, we're managing appropriately. And then on the ecological side, as I mentioned, circularity concepts, all things affecting the environment from an energy use, water, waste, etc. So all of these, of course, are then surrounded, as you can see in the outer layers of the diagram here on the right side, is surrounded by enablers and our stakeholders. So do we have the right strategy? Do we have the right governance model? Do we have the right technology and knowledge management and workforce in terms of some of the key enablers? And then, of course, are we considering all aspects from a stakeholder perspective on a supplier and customer side, of course, but also relative to our community and, of course, our responsibility to the stakeholder of our governments. So this is a handbook of criteria that is really extensive, and it was built on the best of the best, right? It's supply chain specific, the only kind of this kind of sustainability that is focused specifically on supply chain, and it pulls from the SDG goals of the UN Global Compact. It pulls from the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. It pulls from ISO standards. All of these criteria is an assembly of the best, and again, it allows you to be able to assess this on your own. It is open source, it's unbiased, it's not industry specific, and it really helps you to identify potential gaps in your supply chain so you can drive continuous improvement. So you can, again, access both the standards, and there's also, again, a free maturity assessment that you're able to use to, again, identify potential weaknesses in your policies, your procedures, your processes across the 3 dimensions to help you just get better, help you move from good to great. Again, it's a great way to assess how well you are doing. Open source standards, maturity assessment, available free to you. So on the last side, let's talk about from a sensing perspective. So we started this this activity many years ago. In fact, Hans was involved in it at Infineon himself, where we really took a look at trying to understand from everything we're hearing, we're seeing the research that's out there from analysts, from academics, from practitioners, is really what's likely to have the biggest impact on our supply chains going forward. So we started this process inside of what we call our risk team. Our risk team at ASCM is made up of a group of volunteers that focus on 3 elements. So R is for research, I for innovation, and S for sensing. And the sensing team has just released, in fact, you're the first public audience to see it. I just shared it with the board of directors yesterday. And it really is around, what are the key trends that are likely to impact us, and how are those trends moving in and out of what we call the top 10. So let's talk about the overall theme coming out of this sensing event. The overall theme of this is really around enterprise optimization. So if you stack up and you take a look at the collection of the top 10, what you're going to see is there's a strong need for companies to be able to focus on optimizing their entire enterprise to effectively execute, mitigate risk, improve overall agility, responsiveness, and increase their overall competitive advantage. And there's all kinds of aspects of this, from workforce, as you can see, workforce optimization, ERP, so the technology piece, network design in terms of warehousing and distribution footprints, again, inventory strategy, sourcing strategies, customer centricity also featured very heavily for the first time. And then also taking a look at, do we need to reestablish our organizational design to, again, as we talked about in resiliency, to manage an organizational design to meet the new norm, right? What is it that we need? We ourselves, even as an organization, have found that our workforce needs are different than they were on a pre-pandemic basis. We need different skills and different competencies and a different organizational design to support that. So this is, again, you're seeing the list for the first time publicly. It's not even available yet, but I wanted to share it with you today just so you can see what are those key top 10 trends. I mentioned earlier, number one on that list is the need for advanced analytics and a need for automation. This is no change from the 2020 ranking. It topped the list last time around. Talent is gaining momentum. This is one of the things that our chief supply chain officers continue to tell us, and particularly in this world right now is known as, at least in the US, we're calling it the Great Resignation, right? So there's so much need for managing talent and finding and developing and retaining the talent. It's a very high concern right now. Organizations are talking about, in the supply chain world alone, they're having churn and turnover of employees that are in the highest ever percentage ranges, 20 and 30%, for example. Supply chain talent is in just such high demand. It's good for all of us. Visibility, again, separated out for the first time it hits the list. Used to be somewhat buried in risk and resiliency, but now visibility really tops the list. And this is no surprise. Remember, it was one of the key highlights that came out of the resiliency study is also the need for supply chain visibility. A rise in e-commerce, this is moving higher up on the list, and the need, of course, driven by a lot of digital supply chain aspirations and capabilities. Risk and resilience, still on the list. Agility, moved down a little bit, but on the list. Agility needs, also separated out. It had been somewhat topical before, but separated out. The digital supply chain, still on the list. It continues to be a strategic focus for companies. Cybersecurity on the list, again, very much focused on the number of events of information cyber attacks that have happened in many big institutions losing or releasing or having critical data stolen from them. And the last two are new to the list, and that is around customer centricity, the need to get closer to the customer, and of course, artificial intelligence, which is really helping to do a lot of the automation and supplement some of the concerns around talent. So this is just a list of the top trends, their movements and changes from the 2020 rankings. The full report will be released in January. Keep a lookout for that. We'll make an announcement when the full report is released. And it not only will give you the trends and et cetera, but give you definitional understanding of what does this mean and what are companies doing relative to these trends. So it's a lot more information packed in the final report. But I did want to take the time to share this with you again, first time released. One of the other things that we did was take a look at what's the likelihood and the impact, very much in the same flavor of what we talked about earlier on this value at risk measure, is what's the likelihood and the impact associated with these events. So as you can see, there's quite a clustering of these up in the right-hand corner. So the higher the trend, it has been typically the lower the standard deviation. So people felt as though the respondents who helped to determine these rankings really felt that both these were likely to occur, and the impacts of these supply chain trends where people were synced up. They really had a high feeling on those things. As I mentioned, visibility is a new trend, but it moved down a little bit, had a lower standard deviation. Artificial intelligence was a new trend. And then, of course, it was a little bit separated out. It could have been included, of course, with advanced analytics, but it was separated out and therefore got its own position on the top 10 trends. The one that dropped down off the list the most was 3D printing. So that was interesting. It was quite a hype a little bit before, and now is a little bit different. It's still in our top 14, but has dropped off the list. One of the other things we did is take all the top 14, those that were on the 2020 list and the 2021 list, and also took those trends, and then we mapped them to the SCORE model. We said, okay, these have the highest impacting factors in the different score-based supply chain processes. So as you can see, the darker the color, the greater the impact. So a lot of the trends affect the entire supply chain end to end, but some of them, of course, have a bigger impacting factor in different process areas. As you can see here, advanced analytics, high degree of effectivity or impact on plan. As you go to the bottom of the list, you see 3D printing, of course, more having a higher impact relative to make. So depending upon where you sit across the supply chain or within the supply chain, you can see how the different 14 trends could impact that particular process area. So that's, again, the first release associated with that. And maybe just to kind of close out a little bit on our discussion here is really around, again, how do these stack up to the 3 themed areas that we focus on at the Association of Supply Chain Management. The supply chain talents, of course, fitting in these different boxes of talent and customer centricity and demand sensing, demographic changes, etc. You see the different transformation, which of course will include agility and risk and visibility and analytics. And then of course the factors associated with sustainability there. So it is interesting to see that our 3 focus areas can pretty much, we can see how the top 14 trends as were identified by the Sensing Committee stack up to the 3 focus areas that we have here. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. In summary, what I'd really like to say is take advantage of the tools that we develop and make good use of it. Go in and take the supply chain resiliency study, the same question set that we developed in coordination with EIU, and see where your vulnerabilities and resiliency are. Access the standards, the sustainability standards for our enterprise certification. And again, take the maturity assessment that's available to you to understand if you have any weaknesses in maturity or you want to increase your maturity levels across any of the 3 pillars, economic, ecological, or ethical. And take advantage of the research that we've done within the Sensing Committee on the top 10 trends. Again, more information will be available in January with more detail. But again, take a look at, are you managing are you taking a look at how you can take best advantage or how you address any potential concerns of any of these particular trends. So take advantage of those tools, and if we can help in any way, we remain with Symbios to try to help you access the tools or to get more information as desired. And of course, all the material shared today will be made available to you. So Shireen, that's what I wanted to share. If we have time for some questions, we can of course take them.
Yes, please. So some questions are already listed in Q&A. So we can have them quickly. You have so many questions actually. Okay.
Yeah, I see quite a few. So let me, should we try to hit a couple of these in the next 5 minutes
please.
or so?
Yes, there is a question asking you what is the difference between supply chain resilience and supply chain agility?
Yeah, so when we think about, so it's a great question. Thank you for that one. So in the SCORE model concept, we talk about different supply chain attributes. And when we talk about the attribute of agility, we're really talking about our ability to manage the ups and downs, right? So how can different factors affecting us, either positively or negatively, how can we become more agile relative to that? So when we take a look at that agility measure, it's our ability to how many days does it take us, for example, to react to an event occurring? That's really relative to agility. It's very closely tied to resilience, because resiliency, when we're talking about that, is what are the impacting factors that we're doing in order to make us bounce back better, right? So how can we decrease cycle times for these performances? So I think they're very much tied together, oftentimes use the terminology, oftentimes used interchangeably, but resiliency, agility, on that cycle time factor of the positive and negative impact. And resiliency is oftentimes taking a look at our ability to identify and manage risk events and recover from those.
Okay, thank you. There is another question asking you about he doesn't see in the trends offshoring or in reshoring, onshoring or reshoring, which is now a hot subject, especially. Yeah.
Thanks for that question. So it has been a really hot topic, and probably it's and I'll let Hans talk about the chip side of it, but from a reshoring standpoint, this is of course been a really hot topic, specifically around the transportation problem that we have, right? So for example, between China and the US, for example, the cost of freight has 10x in the last 2 years. That's a factor. So I'm tempted to try to offset the advantage of a low labor cost in another country. That may be quickly eaten up in cost relative to transportation. So there is a lot of discussions about the footprint of manufacturing, the footprint of warehousing and distribution centers, which is driving a little bit more discussion relative to whether or not reshoring or nearshoring is a better option than perhaps having a manufacturing facility in Asia to satisfy demand in the US, for example. So it is still a hot topic. We haven't seen, even with that level of transportation disruption, delays, and costs, we haven't seen a massive effort around reshoring. But that tends to be a little bit latent because you can't change a manufacturing footprint overnight. And depending upon the degree of capital investment in some of these facilities, it's not a decision you take quickly, and it's not a decision to take lightly. So we haven't seen the influx of that, but to your question, Mohammed, it is absolutely a discussion point right now. And we have seen a little bit more in terms of the distribution and warehousing side than we have on the manufacturing footprint side in terms of moving things. Because of this movement from just in time to just in case, we have seen a little bit more thoughtful reshoring from a storage location standpoint on inventory, more so than in manufacturing.
Okay, so can we have another question?
Sure, we can take another.
Someone is asking you, what will affect your supply chain in the future?
What won't affect our supply chains in the future? Well, I think the biggest thing is that what we're seeing as a top level trend is that because of all of the recognition of how supply chain is now contributing to both the top line as well as the bottom line, this is really elevating supply chain's voice at the C-suite table. And what I mean by that is, it used to be that in many organizations, maybe even some that you're working, those of you who are working in these organizations today, in many instances, supply chain was thought to be where we control costs, right? Where we manage the effectiveness and the efficiencies associated with the different costs to get a product or a service to market. Now, of course, because of all these changes, it's not just that bottom line impact, it's actually the top line, right? We really now are, within supply chain, been elevated to the understanding that an effectively managed supply chain is not just driving efficiency, it's driving our ability to create revenue, right? And we've had enough companies with sobering reminders of this who have stated in their earnings calls, we can't make the revenue we had targeted because of supply chain, right? So I think the good news around the bad news is there's going to be many aspects that continue to affect the supply chain, and I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. The good side about that is we've been elevated as a discipline in the C-suite.
Okay. Last question. There is a question. What are the tools? No, I would just like take another question related to talents in supply chain. Someone is asking you how we can develop our talents. How can we improve our talents in supply chain?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So there's lots of different ways to access education and training. Of course, we offer different types of training, both self-study and courses, certifications, and now certificates. So the best thing to do is really is to take a look at what are the skills and competencies that you want to have, and we look at that from a process perspective. So let's take if we go back to the top 10 trends, for example, and we say, okay, so we know that the advancement of the use of analytics is going to have a heavy impact on the way in which we can do supply chain planning. So clearly, this is a skill and a competency that needs to get developed. And then take that and take a look at the talents that you have within your supply chain today. And if you recognize that as a gap, then try to find a source to close the gap for that talent. Is there a certification, a training course that you can develop a specific talent and career path for individuals based upon the processes that they're managing? So it's kind of like a career/talent mapping based upon the capabilities and skills that are necessary to more effectively manage the process. So I always look at it from the process first. What are the skills and competencies that are necessary to effectively manage that process? And then try to find a source, either training, education, certification, certificate programs, self-study learning, etc., that can match up with that.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have a question for you as well.
Me too.
Okay.
So, Ibrahim, go on, please.
No, go on first, please.
So I can see you are doing great events around the globe, Douglas. We have been working together for years and years, okay? So one of the things that I'm curious to ask you, you have been developing, you have been part of SCORE, you have been leading and consulting all over the world. How do you reflect on changes after COVID? How would you personally reflect on what's going on related to supply chain?
I think we're in a position right now globally within supply chain that is really challenged. I think we've been good at managing and trying to build efficient supply chains, etc. But I think we've been very slow in reassessing our operating models. I think that we're very slow in making changes. We're very slow in challenging ourselves to adopt new technologies. We're too slow on reorganizing the organization to take advantage of new capabilities. So I think what I hope that we see, particularly since you referenced SCORE, is we're doing a brand new release of SCORE. We're just going to start pulling together the technical teams in January with the release in Q3 of next year. And it will incorporate a roadmap for companies that are inclusive not only of the traditional SCORE model concepts that we have today, but it'll include all of our digital capabilities that we've developed in our DCM model, our digital capabilities model, in collaboration with Deloitte. It will incorporate the enterprise certification standards that I referenced earlier relative to sustainability. And very importantly, it will include the key process aspects that are sitting in other frameworks today, which are in design chain and in customer chain. So these will now all be integrated into one SCORE model. I think what this will do is it'll really help us to move at speed the speed that we need to adjust our supply chain or to reconfigure our operating models much more quickly and much more comprehensively, because now all of these key pieces will be in one model. So companies will be able to more quickly diagnose their supply chain, take a look at their performance, reconstruct their operating models as is necessary. More information to come on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Ibrahim, go on, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kent, for this insightful presentation. I wanted to ask you about the point on sustainability and how that fit with the agenda of agility or supply chain risk mitigation. Usually, most of the companies, they would at the time of crisis or at the time of tension, they would give up all the targets of sustainability first. So how would we incentivize this with company?
Boy, I
know there is no one answer, but I wanted to get your.
I agree 100%. I think the temptation during a time of crisis is to let go of your aspiration. So there is no right answer, right? But one thing is clear: is it's got to be top down, right? If you're going to be the CEO of an organization and you're making public statements of going carbon neutral or having zero emissions or whatever is that sustainability aspiration, you have to hold the organization accountable to not make those short-term decisions that impact negatively that aspiration. So it's really about accountability driven from top down. There's no right answer here. But if we allow that temptation to happen, and we move away from the aspiration, and we're not holding our teams accountable for that, we've really, really missed the boat. Yeah, we absolutely have done that. And that's why I think it's super important that those aspirations get really operationalized into the supply chain, and that we monitor that to ensure that our teams are being held accountable and are not allowed to take decisions in the short term that negatively impact those aspirations. Very good insights. It's the only answer is it's got to be top-down driven.
I agree. Thank you.
All right, Shireen, I think that's time for us. So thank you all very much. I hope it was helpful. Do take advantage of the tools that I shared. And please reach out to Shireen, myself directly, if we can be of any assistance to you.
Thank you, Douglas. And we are super excited to announce that we are partners with ASCM. So we have access to the knowledge, courses, consultation. So we are happy to help everyone here. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
And thank you again for spending your weekend with us. Thank you.
I have a full day board of directors meeting to go to now. So
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.